Hello everyone, and welcome to Voices Behind Reddit. Here we bring you the best stories from Reddit where real experiences and captivating tales come to life. Let's get started.
My husband showed my dad proof of my affair. Everything changed after that. There's a saying that one night can change everything. For Sarah, a 29-year-old woman from Boston, that couldn't be truer. Just one night out with friends, one moment of recklessness, and her entire life was thrown into turmoil. Sarah loved her social life. She was outgoing, spontaneous, and loved planning elaborate events for a living. Her husband, Alex, was quieter, a solid, steady presence in her life. They'd been together for years, had a young son, Max, and lived in a comfortable apartment in Boston. To outsiders, Sarah had it all: a thriving career, a beautiful family, and a loving husband. But under the surface, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. One night, Sarah went out with her friends, looking to unwind after a tough week. Drinks flowed, laughter echoed, and Sarah, feeling free and invincible, let her guard down. That's when things went too far. She found herself caught up in a moment with another man, a moment that was captured on video without her even realizing it. A simple night out had turned into the first chapter of a nightmare she never saw coming. When Alex found the video on her phone the next morning, he was devastated. The look in his eyes, she could never forget. It was as if everything he believed about her, about them, had shattered in an instant. He didn't shout or scream. He simply stared, frozen in a mixture of shock and heartbreak. The silence was almost more painful than any words he could have said. After a few agonizing moments, Alex spoke just one sentence: "You need to leave." But he didn't stop there. He took the video and sent it to Sarah's father. He wanted someone else to know, someone who would understand the weight of what had happened. For Sarah's father, the news was crushing. His once proud daughter, his family's shining light, had let everyone down in the most painful way possible. Sarah was left alone to face the guilt, the shame, and the loss of everything she had taken for granted. Alex packed a few bags, took their son Max, and left for his parents' house. Just like that, her family was gone. The apartment felt empty, hollow, like a shell of what once was. The news spread like wildfire. Sarah could feel her life spiraling, but at that moment, she didn't even know the full extent of the damage that was about to unfold. This was just the beginning of her unraveling, and there was no turning back. When Sarah's betrayal became public knowledge, everything in her life started to crumble. News of the scandal spread quickly, from close friends to business connections, and eventually reached her professional circle. People she once called friends began to distance themselves. It was as if overnight, her life had been put under a microscope, every flaw magnified, every mistake laid bare. Sarah's work in event planning was all about trust and reputation. She was known for her energy, her creativity, and her attention to detail. But after the news broke, some of her biggest clients began calling, asking to cancel their events or move them elsewhere. In just a few weeks, her thriving business, which she had poured her heart into building, was slipping out of her hands. Desperate to keep things together, Sarah tried to stay focused. She thought that if she could just prove she was still the hardworking, dedicated person they knew, people would look past her mistake. She decided to organize a big charity event, hoping it would be a chance to show she was still serious, still someone they could trust. It wasn't just any event though. She chose to dedicate it to mental health awareness, a cause she felt strongly about, especially now as she felt the weight of her own struggles and isolation. But when the day of the event finally arrived, Sarah realized it wasn't going to go as she'd hoped. As guests arrived, the energy in the room felt cold, judgmental. She overheard whispers, glances that were far from friendly. What was meant to be a chance for redemption quickly turned into a public spectacle, with people openly mocking her and questioning her sincerity. Some even whispered that she was using the event to cover up her own scandal. As the night went on, Sarah's confidence began to crack. She tried to ignore the stares, the whispers, but they were impossible to tune out. In the end, she could barely get through her speech. Her voice shook, her hands trembled, and when she finished speaking, there was barely a ripple of applause. Standing there, feeling the weight of every judgmental stare, Sarah felt more alone than ever. By the time she got home, the reality of her situation hit her harder than before. She wasn't just dealing with the loss of her family anymore. Her career, her friends, even her place in her community, all of it felt like it was slipping away, one painful piece at a time. After the failed charity event, Sarah's world felt even smaller, emptier. She put everything she had into trying to make things right, but all she got in return were more doubts, more whispers. The reality of what she had done, and the price she was paying hit her harder every day. Her friends had all but disappeared. Some who had been like family to her stopped returning calls. Others, people she thought she could rely on, no longer invited her to gatherings or even reached out. Her life had shrunk down to a lonely apartment filled with memories of the people she'd lost. Despite everything, there was one thing she still held onto, a faint hope that maybe, somehow, she could fix things with Alex. She wanted to apologize, to explain, to show him she was still the person he had loved. But when she finally got the courage to show up at his office, things didn't go the way she'd hoped. Alex agreed to meet her, but he was distant, barely making eye contact. As she tried to apologize, he stopped her, his face a mix of sadness and disappointment. He told her that her actions had broken something in their family that couldn't be repaired. He spoke softly but firmly, saying that trust, once shattered, isn't something you can just rebuild overnight. Sarah pleaded with him, tried to convince him to think about Max, about the life they'd built together, but he shook his head. "It's not about you and me anymore," he said. "It's about Max. He deserves stability, a home where he can feel safe. I'm going to ask for full custody." Those words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She'd already lost so much, but the idea of losing her son was more than she could bear. She left his office with her head spinning, her heart heavy. She knew then that her marriage was truly over. She couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't erase the hurt she'd caused. That night, alone in her apartment, Sarah felt the weight of everything. The silence was louder than any noise she'd ever heard. She sat there, thinking back to that night, wondering why she'd allowed herself to make such a terrible mistake. She didn't have any easy answers, only regret, a deep, aching regret that seemed to settle into every corner of her life. After that conversation with Alex, Sarah felt like she had nothing left. Losing him was one thing, but the thought of losing her son Max was almost too much to bear. She'd always taken being a mother as the one part of her life that was solid, a role she'd never questioned. But now, even that felt like it was slipping away. The days turned into weeks, and she felt more and more alone. Her apartment, once filled with laughter and warmth, was now just empty rooms echoing with memories. Max's toys were still scattered around, but they felt like reminders of a life she couldn't hold on to. Each time she looked at them, the guilt grew heavier. She knew she had no one to blame but herself, but that didn't make it any easier. She started avoiding her usual places, her favorite coffee shop, the park where she used to take Max. Everywhere she went, it seemed like people knew, like they'd heard about what she'd done. The shame was overwhelming, and before long, she realized she couldn't keep living in the same place. Her apartment was no longer a home. It was a constant reminder of everything she'd lost. So, Sarah made a difficult decision. She put her apartment up for sale, a final step to close the chapter on what her life used to be. She packed up her things, carefully boxed away Max's toys, and put everything into storage. It felt like the end of a story she'd once dreamed of, but it also felt necessary. Staying there, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, was too painful. In her search for some kind of support, Sarah found a group for people dealing with loss, regret, and broken relationships. At first, she wasn't sure if she could open up, if she could actually admit the mistakes she'd made in front of strangers. But as she listened to others share their own stories of regret and heartbreak, she felt a small spark, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in her pain. The group became her lifeline. Little by little, she began to open up, sharing her story piece by piece. She didn't expect forgiveness or sympathy. She just wanted to be honest about what she'd done, about the person she wanted to become. It wasn't easy, and there were many nights she still went home feeling broken, but it was a start. Sarah knew she had a long road ahead of her, but in those quiet, painful moments, she found a small sense of hope. She couldn't change the past, but she could try to build a new life, one where she didn't take things for granted, one where she could look in the mirror and not be ashamed of who she saw. In the months that followed, Sarah started piecing her life back together, bit by bit. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of her past felt unbearable. But through her support group and a newfound determination, she began to see that she had a chance, not to erase her mistakes, but to learn from them, to become a better version of herself. Her first step was a small one, reaching out to apologize to the friends and family she had hurt. Some didn't respond, and that stung, but she understood. Others, like her parents, were cautious but still willing to listen. It wasn't a full embrace, but it was a start, and that was enough for her. She also threw herself back into her work, taking on smaller projects that allowed her to focus and build a new reputation. She worked harder than ever before, treating each event as a way to prove, if only to herself, that she was still capable of something good. Slowly, some clients began to trust her again. She stayed humble, accepting small gigs, knowing that she had to earn her way back, one event at a time. But her most important work was with herself. Sarah committed to being a better mother, even if she couldn't see Max every day. She arranged weekly visits and made those moments count, focusing on him fully, showing him the love and attention he deserved. With each visit, she saw the impact. The way his little face would light up when he saw her, the way he'd run into her arms. Those moments became her motivation to keep going, to keep pushing forward. In her group, she learned that self-forgiveness wasn't about pretending the past didn't happen. It was about accepting her mistakes, knowing she had hurt people, and choosing to do better. It was a slow process, but as the weeks turned into months, Sarah started feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She still had a long road ahead, and there were still things she couldn't undo. But for the first time, she felt hopeful, not because everything was perfect, but because she was finally learning how to be okay with herself, flaws and all. She wasn't running from her past anymore. She was facing it, learning from it, and building a new life, one day at a time. And so, with each step, Sarah began the journey not back to the life she'd lost, but toward the person she wanted to become. A person who had faced her mistakes, who had learned from them, and who, no matter what, was ready to keep moving forward.